A lawsuit has been brought forward in New Brunswick by two Mexican temporary foreign workers against their former employer, a seafood processing company. They are alleging exploitation, mistreatment, breach of contract, and bad faith dismissal against the company LeBreton and Sons Fisheries.
Workers in the seafood industry have been exploited by their employers because the federal government has denied their permanent resident status. They have decided that enough is enough, and they are taking action. This is not just about LeBreton. Right now, hundreds, if it's not thousands of migrant workers across New Brunswick are sitting without work, and their employers are stealing their wages, refusing to pay them what the contracts guarantees. Just this month, we delivered food boxes to 100 workers across New Brunswick who are without income and starving.
This follows the release of a new report from the UN Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Slavery, saying the Temporary Foreign Worker Program is a breeding ground for this form of slavery, contemporary forms of slavery. And the TFW program more generally is under scrutiny, with the federal government now reversing expansion of the low-wage TFW program. Critics say the program suppresses wages and leaves workers vulnerable to abuse. Well, for more on this topic, I'm speaking to Professor Vincenthi Venkatesh from the University of Windsor's Faculty of Law. She's an expert in topics including migrant labor and citizenship law, and she's part of the volunteer collective Justicia for Migrant Workers. With that group, she administers the Migrant Farm Workers Clinic, the first legal clinic for migrant farm workers in Canada. Thanks for joining the NB Media Co-op today, Professor Venkatesh.
Hi, David.
Well, first let's talk about this lawsuit. The former employees at LeBreton Fisheries allege that the company failed to provide the hours of work promised in their contracts, deducted costs for work equipment from their wages, and subjected them to inhumane living conditions, including housing that's described as overcrowded and poorly ventilated, often infested with mold, and with little or no access to essential facilities like laundry. So I guess first of all, based on your experience, could you talk about how common this kind of scenario is for temporary foreign workers?
Yeah, so it's quite common, especially for those who are living in accommodation provided by the employer, the housing aspect, for example. I mean, housing for temporary foreign workers, those in agriculture or in food production, is often provided for by the employer, and there has been very poor oversight of the housing that's being provided, and we've had issues with housing for decades now because of this overcrowding. And then especially during COVID, it led to a lot of outbreaks amongst workers. And now we are seeing it in provinces such as New Brunswick, which has traditionally had not been part of these programs. But in the past few years, the numbers have been increasing in New Brunswick as well.
And so in this kind of scenario, who is legally responsible for the well-being of these workers? Is it the employer? Is it the province? Is it the federal government?
So it's what is called an interjurisdictional responsibility. And in fact, that's one of the things that the UN Special Rapporteur pointed out, is that because so many jurisdictions have been delegated various aspects of the responsibility, what has happened is what he calls interjurisdictional neglect, and other people call it jurisdictional football. So basically one group just tosses their responsibility to another one. That's province, municipality, federal government, sending country, and of course the employers. So the employers are liable, of course, because they're not following the law. But in terms of oversight, all levels of government are supposed to have oversight over what's happening, so that there's some kind of accountability on employers and so on. But because of this jurisdictional issue, we find that temporary foreign workers, the regulation of temporary foreign workers always falls between the cracks. And that's one of the most serious problems that we face. And so all of a sudden, you have unscrupulous employers with carte blanche to do what they want for their profits. So have as many workers, spend less on housing and workplace conditions, don't have work and safety regulations, or training. Those are very common. And we should also remember that the temporary foreign workers work in sectors which Canadians do not want to work in. So they're also usually highly hazardous sectors such as fisheries, agriculture, mining, construction, and so on. So in these sectors, the vulnerability to injuries and to forms of, even all sorts of health trauma is very high. And given that, for example, if you take fisheries and agriculture, there's no steady income often, so they're subject to the vagaries of harvest or catching fish or the fishing season. And usually, if they were Canadian, what they would do is just leave the job, saying that, well, this is an unsteady, precarious work. I don't want to be part of it. But now what you have is a group of workers who are basically tied to the employers and who have no choice but to be with them through this. So it leads to parts where they're unpaid or paid less. I mean, one of the biggest problems is wage theft, what's called wage theft, where the employers undercut their wages, and they usually do so by all sorts of deductions, as you pointed out in this case. During COVID, some of the workers were asked to pay for their own PPE, masks, and all that, when by the government said it has to be provided by the employers. So these are very common issues. And then in sectors like fisheries and agriculture, where there's so many vagaries of production, you'll find that there'll be weeks where workers are working 70, 80 hours. And in provinces such as Ontario, there where you don't have overtime wages for those in agriculture and a lot of food production areas, they're not even paid extra for this, but they're forced to do that, well, because they need the income to pay for the debt which they have incurred in just coming to Canada.
There's a flip side with these kinds of vagaries, isn't there? Where, in this case with LeBreton Fisheries, the workers say that they were forced to rely on food banks in this rural area of New Brunswick, northern New Brunswick, because there was just no work available for them. Have you heard of this kind of thing happening before?
Yeah, so it's quite, as I said, it's very common in agriculture and fisheries that usually, when you think about labor, there is a understanding that there's going to be a minimum wage. I don't mean like minimum hourly wage, but that there's a minimum income that workers would make in any steady long-term contract, right? Or you have hourly part-time contracts. People work like you have in the gig economy. You work for 2 hours and then you do something else. But these workers cannot do something else because their work permit ties them to this particular employer. So they're stuck in this place where they have not even the basic freedoms that Canadian workers have to do other work, to work for another employer, and to deal with this issue. So they're stuck where there'll be weeks where they're here and they have no income. And all these workers are fending for their families back home in global south countries, which have a lot of income problems. The reason why they're here is not necessarily out of choice, as we put it, but because they're forced to come here, leaving their families behind. So they lose that income too. And there's a generational impact too. We see the impact on their families back home when they're working in this, and it adds massive to stress. So a lot of the workers have PTSD and stress from having precarious income, because 1 week they'll have, and then the next week they have to work for 70, 80 hours to compensate for what they did not get the previous week. And these are the sectors actually which have always said, look, we have a labor shortage. And it is true, they do have a labor shortage. Economically speaking, they do have a labor shortage. But the reason why they have a labor shortage is because of the nature of the workplace conditions, of the work conditions. And that is kind of the the irony of the situation. We need these workers to come here for these sectors, but at the same time, we don't want to give them too many rights. And we certainly don't want to give them the right to stay back and be part of our communities. So we see long lines in food banks. In fact, during COVID, for the agriculture workers, because they're even more remote, we at Justicia, we entered into an arrangement with Food Share to provide for food to the workers. Because even at food bank, a lot of these workers come from countries with their own, cultural food habits and so on. So to have culturally appropriate food as well. So it's really there's so many issues with what the workers are going through, and it's quite sad that that their humanity they're so dehumanized and they just become numbers for the economy or numbers for the labor workforce.
Now, the Migrant Workers Alliance for Change has called this lawsuit in New Brunswick unprecedented. Are you aware of other examples of migrant workers suing their employers in New Brunswick or other parts of Atlantic Canada? I think that there have been examples, at least in Western Canada.
Yeah. So there have been examples in BC. In terms of fisheries, there was a very famous case in Ontario as well called Prestige a few years back, which involved women workers. So there have been, but I think what is unique about the New Brunswick case is that in BC, I mean, if you think about numbers, we are talking about 50,000 workers, temporary foreign workers, 20,000 in food production, or rather 38,000, 50 is Ontario. So around 38 to 40,000 workers in temporary foreign work, with around 15 to 20,000 in food production. In Ontario, we are talking about 50,000 workers with around 30,000 workers in food production. And those same numbers in New Brunswick are quite small. We are talking about 4,000 workers with about 600 to 700 workers in food production. So you would think that in such a small that with such a small, even when the population is so small, you could have such egregious conditions. That is what makes it unique in that place. And also it's extremely rare for workers, even in Ontario and BC, where they have all of the support because of the sheer numbers that there are, to sue their employers in such a big lawsuit. So a lot of time, this wage theft issues just go to the Ministry of Labor, and then it just goes to the Labor Board Tribunal where it gets settled. So to be able to claim a lawsuit for exploitation, such forms of exploitation, we are talking, that means imagine how much is actually underlying, like what has not come out. So that has always been, so for every lawsuit of this kind that you're seeing, there would at least be many other cases where the workers haven't had the capacity, the support to be able to bring it to the level of the lawsuit. Because, as a lawyer, I can say that there's so many access to justice issues for even you and me, so let alone for migrant workers. So that's what makes the lawsuit unique.
It's interesting to see how over the years there have been persistent criticisms of the TFW program from labor and migrant justice groups. There have been calls for the program to be abolished, for migrant workers to receive permanent status on arrival. It's quite a long-standing demand, with the slogan "good enough to work, good enough to stay." Yet the program has expanded over the years, and controversy seems to flare up periodically. And lately in media reports, we see reference to unemployment rates as a factor, perhaps the main factor in this renewed scrutiny. What do you think is driving the kind of scrutiny that this program is under right now?
So the unemployment data is quite an interesting number, because we're talking about aggregate unemployment. And for the temporary foreign workers, the ones in tied work permits, they are usually employed in sectors where there is a labor shortage. So those places are not supposed to be affected by the unemployment numbers to begin with. Certainly with the rise of I guess, international students working under open work permits, which is also not that big a number. I mean, if you're talking about temporary residents with the Ukraine crisis, Canada offered 900,000 temporary resident permits to Ukrainians to come. There was no noise at that time. So I would say we have to really understand what's happening when suddenly you have black and brown workers in the news. Why is there such a big reaction to their presence in our country? Right? And especially black and brown low wage workers. So there's a class and race intersection too. And that's another problem when we think of immigration in general. I mean, there's been a history. I mean, immigration of racism in Canada's immigration. I mean, all the way from the Chinese workers coming to labor and so on. So there is, and at the same time, and even if you see the UN Special Rapporteur report, it doesn't start with migrant workers. That's an interesting part of the modern slavery report. It actually starts with Canada not fulfilling its responsibilities in other countries where the products that are produced by Canadian companies in the value chain, workers in other countries who are working for Canadian subsidiaries and so on, work in what they call slave-like conditions. And there is no oversight of multinational companies in Canada. There is no oversight of the trade agreements and how they're causing the very problems in these global south countries that is creating this extraordinary global inequality. At the same time, Canada wants to wipe its hands off of its global responsibilities by saying, we'll shut the borders with the United States, which they did with the STCA, and now we only have, we'll have a brain drain. We only want brain drain, right? We only want we only want the Einsteins in our country, but we do not want anybody who actually does the work that you all need. So there is a strong underlying current of I would say, racism, neocolonialism, and imperialism in this. And certainly when this comes up, and we have seen this historically, when there's a crisis in the country, for example, with homelessness, with unemployment. I mean, these are all real crises. Don't get me wrong, we need a boogeyman, and the boogeyman that is found is in the migrant worker, is in the racialized, invisibilized, class oppressed, low wage worker. When actually what the problem is, in general, there has been a problem with with the Canadian welfare state, or provincial welfare especially, washing its hands off the responsibilities towards good health, good housing for everybody who is there. It's not just about Canadians and non-Canadians, but everybody who's within the border. And so you see the intersections of policy failures in other places being blamed on this group. And this is not just a 2024 incident. It happened in 2008. It happened in the early 1900s with the Chinese workers and the South Asian workers, and it happens every time.
So it's a phenomenon of scapegoating, similar to what we see in
Yeah,
the United States
exactly.
with Trump pledging the biggest mass deportation in American history. Uh, Canada not insulated from factors such as inflation, housing affordability crisis, and so on. People are venting their frustrations on essentially black and brown poor workers.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's why we have to, I think, it cannot be separated out. It's not something that just works in its silo, which we imagine it to be. It's very closely interrelated to everything, as all policies are. Housing is related to education. There is a huge outcry against international students. And why is that? It's because every province has reduced its funding for university education. So now you have these universities which are now relying on student fees for surviving, and so the student fees for international student fees is so high that they are now using international students for their budget, when students should be here to study no matter where they're from. They should not be seen as a labor source. They should not be seen as a money source for the education system to survive. But now students have been quantified as well as being money providers, instead of as something we are doing for the future of the country, of the world, so that we create better citizens. And that these kinds of things, and same thing with housing, as you pointed out, there's a cost of living crisis, but there's been no input on how to make low-income housing, housing a serious policy. There's been, the amount of low-income housing has drastically dropped over the years that the government has been providing, that provinces have been providing. So these are all interrelated. And we come back to jurisdictional issues. We see that it's because these housing and education, they end up being provincial issues, whereas immigration is a federal issue. So it's very easy to zone in on what's happening federally and find them to be the problem for all that's happening at the provincial, at the municipality levels. And the migrant workers are stuck in between all these jurisdictions.
Now, looking at some of the recent changes to the temporary foreign worker program, the Globe and Mail reports that in 2022, the federal government made sweeping changes to the TFW program, saying it was crucial to fill a glut of job vacancies as pandemic restrictions were being eased. One of those changes allowed employers to hire up to 20% of their staff through the low-wage stream of the TFW program, up from 10%, and in some industries the cap was set at 30%, the Globe and Mail reports. Now with these latest changes, the share of low wage, or I should say some of these latest changes, because there have been quite a few, TFWs, the share of low wage TFWs that employers can hire will be capped at 10% of the total workforce. It also says the announcement earlier this week said employers won't be able to hire low-wage TFWs in places where the unemployment rate is 6% or higher. However, there are exceptions, including notably for New Brunswick, in food sectors, including fish processing. So it's a lot to wrap your head around all these changes. But I guess one thing I'm wondering is, what can we say about the federal government's record on this issue? How does the Liberal government under Justin Trudeau compare to Stephen Harper's conservatives in terms of how they're managing this file?
But there's some notable differences and some commonalities. So the federal government has always used immigration as this kind of a band-aid to signal things. So it's like, oh, we need to have economic growth. Let's have temporary foreign workers. Oh, we are having this crisis. Oh, let's stop this. Oh, we are having a post-COVID post-COVID labor shortage. Let's suddenly come up with these strategies. And then these are all short-sighted strategies at that time at the policy level, which don't see the persistent problem that it's trying to solve. And then what we are left with then are these people, and it's the same issue that happened under the Harper government, that there's this point at which people are like, oh my God, there are 300,000 temporary workers. We have to do something about it. And then on the same day, like for example, just a policy was changed yesterday on the changing of on the capacity to change from a visitor permit to a work permit. So so it is changed immediately. So all of a sudden it's going to be leaving tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of workers without status. And then we are back to the Harper era, which was this mass deportation, which had to do mass deportation, like how you're hearing of during the Trump, from Donald Trump, as you pointed out, where suddenly you're left without status. So we have, so basically it's what is common between the two, between every federal government, is this use of these band-aids to give something, take something with the other hand, at the same time not do anything structurally to a system which has been problematic since its inception. So that has been the difference between the federal and the Liberal and Harper's government is that for all cross purposes, the Liberal government did try to at least acknowledge that there are problems of exploitation. So for example, they instituted an open work permits, a vulnerable open work permit system. It was very limited, so only for 1 year, not that great, as usual, a band-aid again, without looking at the systemic issues, but they at least did that. Similarly with students.
The tip line also is another example. I think the federal government will
Yes,
often
yes,
point to when they talk
exactly.
about. exploitation of vulnerable workers.
Exactly. Yeah. So the Liberal government is able to talk from both sides, right? Oh yeah, we want to do the same things that the Conservatives want to do, but we'll also do these provide some form of safety nets. So that's kind of the strategy. Whereas under the Harper government, you had no safety net whatsoever. You had the 4x4 rule where workers had to come and then they had to leave and they can never come back. So even if they've formed all these communities, even if they've got all these trainings, they could never come back. But for in the Harper era, it was 4 years. They could actually be here for 4 years. The Liberal government instead last week has changed that to 1 year. So you can only have a work permit for 1 year and then you have to leave the country. So it's actually far worse than what the Harper government had. But at the same time, you do have all of these kinds of things which they say, oh yeah, we do acknowledge there's serious problems and so on and so forth. But again, it's because we are left with the history of immigration somehow being seen as the solution for all the all the social and economic problems we have in Canada. And workers are just these tools that you can get them, throw them out, get them, throw them out whenever you feel like. So that has not changed. And this whole this whole backlash against the low wage workers especially is extremely problematic. It's extremely problematic for Canadian working class as well, for Canadian working class who work in these low wage sectors, because these are seen to be sectors that of disposable workers. And the reason why Canadians do not work in those sectors is because they know, even the working class Canadian knows, they seem to be disposable. It's just that they can walk away more easily, but it's not as if these workers can. And with these limits that we are seeing, what's going to happen is that as it is, Canada has a very serious problems with what's called underemployment, which is not captured in the unemployment. So people with degrees, with, you hear about the newcomer immigrant who has a medical degree but is driving taxis. So that issue is only going to continue. And again, you're going to have racialized people, but this time permanent residents who have just come without the networks that they have, taking in these low income jobs, even though they would be qualified for something else. So again, the main problem is we are not going back to what's actually happening in these sectors. How can we make fisheries? How can we make agriculture a secure workplace for everyone? How can we make these sectors that are hiring all of these workers? How can we ensure worker safety for everyone? If we start with that premise, how can we ensure a cost of living for everyone? Then you wouldn't be seeing migrant workers as a problem. You'll be seeing the overall system as a problem.
Finally, as mentioned in the introduction, the UN Special Rapporteur's report saying this program, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, is a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery. Can you comment on this report and its significance?
Yeah, so the report is actually a really good report. And as I said, that the report expands on Canadian policies which create slave-like conditions across many areas. It has an entire section on homelessness and issue on homelessness crisis in certain areas, sections on Indigenous poverty, sections on how Indigenous incarceration, Black incarceration, sections on what's happening in the value chain. So what the whole report shows is that Canada is really failing in the way we are thinking about creating vulnerable and exploitable populations across the board. And what we have, and why the temporary foreign workers is a paradigm of it, is we have the system where we are literally confining people to bad conditions. There's no liberty to move. The very basic freedom that we have to walk away from something bad happening to us is not given to them. So certainly they're saying that, well, if you have a group which is forcibly confined, be it what we have is the same kind of conditions that happened during the time of slavery, where people couldn't move out, where Black and racialized people couldn't move out because they were considered to be property, during indentureship, where they couldn't move out because the contract forced them to be in that place. And now with the temporary foreign worker program, again, they cannot move. So it's a question of liberty and freedom. We are creating the conditions that are there is extremely prone, no matter how many good employers you have. It is at the very level, what you have is kind of a confined, almost imprisoned population that you're creating for your work. So that's basically what they're going. And in fact, yeah, and you can see why that would be a breeding ground for highly exploitable conditions, which come close to what would be called modern slavery, is because they cannot walk away, just as they couldn't walk away from these previous forms of confined labor, such as colonial slavery and indentureship.
Well, anything else to add before we wrap up today, Professor Venkatesh?
No, thank you very much for having me here, and thank you for this lovely conversation.
Well, I've been speaking with Professor Vinsanthi Venkatesh from the University of Windsor's Faculty of Law. Thanks again for joining the NB Media Co-op today.
Thank you.